Okay, I'll admit that I'm not a fan of the Conservative approach to much of anything in Canada, and just like most people, I'm guilty of falling into bias traps that cloud my view of Conservatives. So I thought it would be helpful for myself, and maybe you, to go over 5 Conservative myths that I fall under the spell of all the time. I want to expand my thinking on these things to try seeing them from the Conservative perspective. I'll tell you before we go any further in this video, it was pretty tough in some cases. You'll see. Myth number 1, Conservatives hate change. It may seem like Conservatives don't want anything to change, and many of us on the left constantly trot out the old Conservatives want to take Canada backwards thing. But what I've tried to understand is that Conservatives aren't necessarily resistant to change. It's more that they don't think government has a role in pushing change forward. Conservatives understand that societal change is inevitable, and as for government, sure, government can support societal changes once it becomes clear that the bulk of society is already heading that way. And I know what some of you are going to say. Some provinces with Conservative governments do not, in fact, support societal change when it goes against their ideology. Well, I can't argue with you on that point. But for many of us on the left, we think government has a specific role to play in nudging Canadian society forward with change. In fact, maybe even an obligation. Same-sex marriage, for instance. It's hard to imagine a Conservative government advocating for fair treatment of Canadians in the LGBTQ2S+ community, and it took left-leaning politicians to support the community to get rid of the ridiculous law around who can marry. But I'm not hearing a constant barrage of comments from Pierre Poilievre that a future Conservative government will roll back that change, because Conservatives recognize that it was actually a good change, a just change to make Canadian society more fair. And sure, I wish Conservatives would take a more fair and human approach to inequities in other parts of Canadian society, but I think I understand a bit more about why they don't feel that's the job of government, even though I think it is. Myth number 2, Conservatives are better with money. Yeah, this is a big one. The conventional thought, not just in Canada, but in other countries as well, is that if you put Conservatives in charge, they'll spend our tax dollars much more wisely than Liberals. Not so fast there, buddy. The evidence contradicts this. While there are a lot of examples to show Conservatives are just as bad with our money as Liberals, such as the fact that Stephen Harper inherited a $12 billion budget surplus when he became Prime Minister, and then pissed it all away and ran deficits for 8 of the first 9 years of his time in office. Let's look at the Ontario case study of Premier Doug Ford. For a Conservative who's supposedly better with money, he sure has wasted a lot of it. A recent report from the Financial Accountability Officer in that province, it's a provincial watchdog for spending, said that as just one example, the expansion of alcohol sales in grocery and convenience stores will cost that province $1.4 billion. $612 million of that directly because of the Conservative government's decision to speed up that expansion by a year. Who in their right mind would say, well, this issue of beer convenience is so important that it's imperative we break a contract and pay over $500 million in fees and other costs to speed up the availability of beer in convenience stores by 1 year. That does not sound like a good use of Ontario taxpayers' money. To make this particular myth-busting even worse for me personally, I find myself agreeing with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, GAG, who said about Doug Ford, "The emperor of so-called fiscal responsibility has no clothes." Their article is really critical of the Conservative government in Ontario. In Ontario alone, there are lots of other examples of Conservatives demonstrating how bad they are with money. Ordering the cities of Toronto and Ottawa to remove bike lanes, estimated to cost tens of millions by Toronto alone. There's a new highway Doug Ford's Conservatives are building as well, one that no one wants and no urban planner thinks is anywhere close to being a good idea. The price tag for that? Who knows? Doug Ford won't tell anyone, so you gotta know it's gonna be astronomical. What a waste of money. The myth that Conservatives are good with money has been completely busted. Thanks for that, Ontario. Myth number 3, Conservatives are selfish. I thought this one was going to be pretty challenging to debunk, but this is one of the benefits of trying to see things from the perspective of others you may not agree with. Now I feel that I can smash this myth too and convince you that conservatives do, in fact, care about other people. One of the first things to point out is at a small scale. Conservatives are no less engaged in community issues than anyone else. Conservatives donate time and money to the causes that are important to them, and just like the rest of us, those causes are impacted by the people in our lives and the things we've experienced personally. But it's when we zoom out and take a look at larger societal issues, that's when it's tempting to claim conservatives just don't care if it doesn't affect them personally. A core conservative value is personal responsibility. Conservatives believe that if you work hard, anyone can succeed. Don't use the word privilege with a conservative. They'll blow an aneurysm, because conservatives don't tend to believe that sort of thing exists. Because conservatives feel it's within the capacity of everyone to succeed, they believe government shouldn't be playing as large a role in people's lives. Social programs that they themselves don't use tend to be less important to them, and the idea of cutting these programs is appealing because they think it will lead to lower taxes for themselves as individuals. If taxes are lower, they argue, people would have the money they need to pay for these things themselves. Yes, this ignores the fact that oftentimes it's better to pool resources to get a better outcome, and if we leave these social programs solely up to charities and the goodwill of individual donors, then it'll be way less efficient and way less effective. What I found is that conservatives are all about maximizing the ability of the individual to thrive. Okay, that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. We should enable everyone to succeed, even though everyone in Canada is not starting at the same spot or has the same supports or opportunities. Unfortunately, individualism often comes at the expense of the collective. The whole keep your hands off my stack approach that conservatives typically embrace doesn't mean they want others to fail. It can be boiled down to survival instincts, I suppose. Maybe conservatives take the airplane oxygen mask approach. You put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others with theirs. And that's not hard to understand. The question to be answered by conservatives is, when will you be ready to help others with their oxygen mask? How much personal gain is enough? I think that anyone in Canada can strive to be rich, but no one should be poor. That isn't generally a concept conservatives embrace, but at least I have a better understanding about where they're coming from. You could still call them selfish, or take a gentler approach and say they're just enabling each of us to succeed ourselves without much help. Myth number 4, conservatives don't care about climate change. Yeah, I'm not so sure I'm going to do a very good job convincing anyone that this is a myth. The evidence is pretty overwhelming, but I'm going to give it a shot. Conservatives value time spent with family, time spent outdoors doing things like fishing, hunting, hiking, generally enjoying what our fantastic Canadian landscape has to offer. Given a binary choice between having a clean, healthy environment where everyone can enjoy these things, or having an environment where forest fires rage 9 months of the year and you can't manage to build the kids a hockey rink in the backyard in the winter anymore, of course conservatives are going to choose the clean environment. Conservatives are not monsters. Cut. Most conservatives are not monsters. The tricky part is the sacrifice that's required in order to maintain that clean environment. There's the rub. Those on the political left recognize that climate change is largely irreversible, so we want to do what's necessary right now and look at the obvious solutions. Use less fossil fuels. Make the fossil fuels we do need to use cleaner. And make it expensive for people to pollute so they have a greater incentive to not pollute. You know, tax the things we don't want. Conservatives tend not to be into that though. If something's going to cost them more right in this moment, they don't want it. Remember, conservatives tend to live in the here and now and are less concerned with what life is going to be like for everyone 10, 15, 20 years from now. But does that mean conservatives don't care about fighting climate change? No. They just prefer solutions they think won't cost them anything. Pierre Poilievre, while he hasn't really told us in any sort of detail what climate change plan he's thinking of, has mentioned some vagaries about funding technological solutions like carbon capture and storage. Conservatives can get behind this because to them it makes sense. It allows them to keep on doing what they're doing, living their lives without changing anything with their use of fossil fuels, and some magic machine that does a really, really poor job collects carbon emissions after they've been created. Instead, shouldn't we think about when the least expensive time to work on a problem like emissions is? That's before we generate the emissions in the first place. My point is that it's simplistic to think conservatives don't care about climate change. They do. They just don't want it to cost them anything personally, and they don't want climate change effort to impact their current way of life. They want someone else to figure out how to stop climate change without changing anything themselves. But they also don't want our planet to continue on its current path to destruction. Myth 5. Conservatives don't have any new ideas. Oh, come on. That's not true. It's not. Conservatives can, and do, sometimes have new ideas. You cynics out there will probably point to the conservative housing plan, which is almost identical to the liberal plan, and the very few small differences the conservative plan does have strive to do exactly the same thing as the liberal plan and likely won't be any more or less effective. But I do have an example of creative conservative thinking. Pierre Poilievre's response to Donald Trump's tariff threat was to outline a 4-point plan. Point 1. Hold a meeting with Canada's premiers within 30 days of becoming Prime Minister to discuss removing trade barriers. Okay, well, that was already in the works before Poilievre suggested it. There's actually an existing federal committee on interprovincial trade. Okay, so maybe that one isn't a new idea. The next one sure is, though. Work on developing a national standard for trucking rules to encourage east-west shipping over north-south shipping. Actually, that one's already happening as well. It was announced by the Liberal government back in September 2024. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Point 3, create a professional qualification recognized in all provinces that would allow doctors, nurses, and engineers to work anywhere in the country. Doctors, nurses, and engineers already can work in provinces other than when they were trained. Look, this can't be Poilievre's plan that he announced in February of 2025. It's the same thing the Liberals are already doing. I don't understand. Point 4, offering a free trade bonus to provinces who drop trade barriers. Okay, there we go. I don't think that one's being done. See, that's a new idea. Very clearly, the myth that conservatives don't have any new ideas has been busted. And as a bonus point, Pierre Poilievre last week just came out with a new 3-word slogan, Stop the Drugs. The creativity continues. I think this type of thing is good for us all to do. Challenge our notion of what the other side is all about. I think if we're all open to not just blindly believing myths that we're told about conservatives, we'll all be better able to see things from their perspective and maybe stand a better chance of working together rather than just throwing out empty 3-word slogans to get a soundbite.